Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Joe Gallo, the man whose bold personality and rebellious spirit made him one of the most unforgettable figures in New York's underworld. Known for his sharp wit, fearless attitude, and love for the spotlight, Gallo lived life with a flair that few could match. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Joe Gallo guide you into the night. He arrived in Brooklyn at the close of the 1922nd, a tough decade turning into an even harder one. The row houses, the docks, the creak of delivery carts, tenement windows flung open in summer. This was his first classroom. The Depression left its fingerprints on everything, and survival felt like a trade kids learned early. He had two brothers close in age, a pack that shared cheap meals and louder dreams. Neighbors remembered a wiry boy who studied faces, who cracked jokes to mask a quick temper, a kid who could be gentle with younger children and then fierce with anyone who pushed too hard. The streets around the Gowanus and Red Hook were crowded with working people, longshoremen, seamstresses, shopkeepers, and hustlers of every stripe. If you lingered at the corner candy store before dinner, you heard a crash course in the city's unofficial economy: who owed, who paid, who ran numbers, and who made sure nobody got in the way. By his teens, he knew the neighborhood's unwritten rules, and he liked testing them. It started with small things: a deck of cards here, a dice game there, a little side money carrying envelopes for men who didn't talk much, learning the names of bars where a boy could vanish for an afternoon and come back with a few dollars tucked behind his belt buckle. He was quick with a grin, calm under pressure, and brave in a way that can look like recklessness when you're older. Police blotters from those years show familiar charges for a young hard case: petty theft, possession of tools better suited to break-ins than schoolwork, disturbing the peace after a backroom brawl. None of it felt minor to his family, who wanted him to learn a trade, but the pull of the corner life was strong. If school books gave you words, the streets gave you power, or at least the illusion of it, and in a neighborhood strapped for cash, that illusion could feed you. He picked up a nickname early, the one that would stick for the rest of his life. It didn't come from doctors or files. It came from a reputation for doing the unexpected, for laughing a little too loud when someone tried to scare him, for making any room feel like a stage. Newspapers later stamped the label in ink, and people repeated it until it sounded like his real first name. He treated the nickname like armor. If you think I'm unpredictable, then maybe you won't try me. Behind the bravado there was an undeniable magnetism. He was helpful to people who had nothing. He slipped bills to families when rent was due. He watched out for older neighbors who worried about getting home late. The contradictions made him fascinating. A person who could cause trouble and then turn around and fix someone's day left people unsure whether to smile or to step back. As he grew into his 20s, the men who ran Brooklyn's rackets noticed. This was the era when official family names were known only in whispers, but guided everything from waterfront hiring to which jukebox got plugged into which tavern. The organization, led by Joseph Profaci, operated like a business wrapped in family language. It had a structure, predictable lanes of money, a chain of command, and rules about who could sit where at a table. New blood came in through friends and relatives. His older brother was already respected for toughness and steadiness. The youngest was quick, loyal, and eager. Together, the three formed a tight unit that drew attention because it acted like a company inside the company, a crew that agreed among themselves first, and then answered to the bosses. They found a home under the wing of men who valued daring and results. The jobs at first were classic city rackets. If a shopkeeper needed a loan no bank would touch, someone from their crew delivered the envelope and came back every week to collect. If a truck with liquor, cigarettes, or clothing was parked carelessly on a dark block, the load sometimes changed destination, and everyone understood the limits of curiosity. If a bar owner wanted steady customers, a jukebox and pinball machine appeared, and the split got tallied in the same notebook as the weekly protection fee. Gambling was the heartbeat numbers slips in pockets, card games in back rooms, off-track bets placed by busy men who didn't want to visit the track. The crew enforced order with a quiet presence. You didn't need loudness when your reputation spoke first. Plenty of people resented the control, but others preferred predictable costs to the chaos of random predators. In that gray zone, he found his stride. He moved money, but he also moved people. He had a gift for storytelling, for turning small-time runners into loyal workers, for convincing fence-sitters that this was the safest path. He paid on time, he spread around a little generosity, and he listened when younger guys had something to say. He could be kind, then demanding, then playful within an hour. That range made him dangerous in negotiations and oddly comforting to those who worked for him. The crew's clubhouse on President Street became a hive. Men popped in for instructions, food, jokes, and the feeling of belonging. The same feeling that keeps people in bad jobs because the lunchroom laughs make it tolerable. Rumors about a pet lion nosing around a back office added to the mystique. Whether or not it was as dramatic as people claimed, the story traveled because it fit the image. A crew that liked theatrics as much as results. In the late 1950 seconds, a major shakeup in one corner of Brooklyn turned his ambitions into open conflict. A powerful captain who had long controlled a busy bookmaking district was cut down in a swift operation that removed him from the map. The livelihood of his territory, the gamblers and collectors and bartenders who kept the numbers humming, needed new management. The brothers expected a serious share. They had done heavy lifting for the bosses. They believed they had earned the right to run those routes and keep the lion's slice. When the split felt light and the promises felt slippery, their anger hardened. A private grievance grew into a public standoff inside an organization that ran on obedience. It wasn't just about cash, it was about respect. The brothers took it personally, and he took it more personally than anyone. Authorities linked their crew to a pattern of forceful persuasion during this period, storefronts that paid after break-ins, truckers who agreed to routes after sudden accidents, and rivals who vanished from their favorite booths. Much of it never saw a courtroom. People in that world rarely raised their hands to testify. But the rumors grew, and so did attention from other families who saw the brothers as both valuable and volatile. Around the same time, a headline shook the city. The killing of Albert Anastasia, a power in another organization who was struck down in a midtown shop. Journalists and police started praising and blaming theories with the same breath. One theory pegged his team as muscle in the operation. Another said a different set of hitters did the job. Nothing was proven in a court. For our purposes, it matters that his name began to orbit high-profile events. When your name is said in the same breath as a famous killing, doors open and alarms go off. The man at the top of their own organization was old school, patient, and famously stingy with concessions. He ran his empire like a careful merchant, counting every chip twice. A small rebellion by hot-headed youngsters wasn't something he planned to reward. Meetings dragged, promises floated and dropped. The brothers started to feel boxed in, and he, the middle brother with the biggest taste for drama, pushed for something dramatic. If leverage was missing, they would create leverage. They started watching schedules, taking notes on who met whom and when, and how those men got to their dinners. He told friends that a quiet life might have been enough if he felt respected. But respect to him looked like territory and a say in top-level decisions. When polite talk stalled, the street took over. In the spring of 1961, a plan that sounded impossible in barroom whispers turned into the real thing. Instead of pleading with the boss, the brothers reached for his lieutenants. In careful strikes, without the kind of chaos that draws sirens, several of the family's most trusted figures were seized and made to sit out the next moves. Some accounts named specific captains, others kept the identities vague, but all sources agreed the targets were close to the boss. The message rang clear: share power fairly, or watch your inner circle stay sidelined. The brothers weren't asking anymore, they were demanding. And he relished the move not because it was reckless, but because it felt like the only path left. Word spread up and down the boroughs before the day ended. The city's underworld thrives on gossip as much as cash, and this gossip said the old order was wobbling. Negotiations followed. Deals were offered. Parole for the hostages came with terms that sounded good in a hallway and looked flimsy on a ledger. In those tense weeks, he stood taller than ever in public and smiled from the corner of his mouth like a person who hears music nobody else hears. He told allies they had forced the boss to the table. He told doubters they were safer with him than with anyone else. When the captives were let go, he expected quick movement on the promises. Instead, he watched the clock and noticed nothing change. The top man bided his time. He had no intention of letting upstarts rewrite his playbook. He believed hunger fades. He believed pressure dissolves if you wait long enough. He might have been right in an ordinary dispute. This time, he misread the temperature. Retaliation arrived quietly at first, then louder. Cars that once rolled through certain neighborhoods without a second glance started getting tailed. Allies took calls from old friends who suddenly sounded icy. Lines shifted, then snapped. In one notorious episode at a nightlife spot, his older brother was ambushed by men who tried to silence him permanently in front of witnesses. A brazen attack interrupted by an officer whose timing turned the scene into a scandal for the attackers rather than a funeral for the target. The message cut both ways. The old guard was willing to hit them anywhere, but the city was unpredictable, and even a back room wasn't as safe as it used to be. He wore the incident like a warning and a rallying flag. War inside the family had officially begun. Beyond the headlines, the day-to-day continued. Loans still needed collecting. Bookies still owed tallies. Businesses still paid their weekly fees. He tried to keep his corner of the map running, even as the ground shook. He spoke with union figures, squeezed vendors with overdue accounts, and reminded men who thought of switching sides that loyalty in a storm is how history judges you. It's never clean when a crew chooses conflict over compromise. People get scared. People hedge. He had a knack for calming a room and then firing it up in the same hour, a trait that helped him maintain control as the costs of their rebellion mounted. He didn't pretend they were saints. He did insist they were men who had earned their place. The police watched more closely. He and his brothers picked up new arrests: possession of unlicensed weapons, intimidating a witness, interfering with officers who stepped into their territory at awkward moments. Some charges stuck. Others fizzled as witnesses forgot what they saw. Through it all, he kept a public face that fascinated reporters. He dressed like a movie star, smiled for photographers, greeted neighbors by name, and then disappeared into rooms where decisions changed the fate of entire blocks. Religiously, he avoided talk that could be construed as instruction. He spoke in parables and jokes. If someone asked about a specific incident, he turned to humor. He knew that talk ruins men like him. Silence and style, in his experience, kept you standing. Money came from the same familiar sources. Jukebox routes remained a river of cash. Cigarettes moved across borough lines in ways that bypassed taxes. Cards and dice changed hands in apartments where the curtains were always drawn. He made sure small-time earners got paid enough to stay loyal. He dispensed quiet help to widows and shopkeepers who couldn't catch a break. These gestures built a version of him that neighbors remembered fondly, even as they understood that his income rested on the fear of what might happen if people refused. He did not invent those fears, but he did use them. By the time the calendar turned, he was a symbol, not just a man. To some, he represented a new generation refusing to bow to distant bosses. To others, he was a threat to a system that kept violence contained to a few predictable corners. He leaned into the myth because myths protect you as much as they endanger you. The larger-than-life personality masked a simple truth. He was an ambitious neighborhood operator whose choices had dragged his family into a fight with men who had far more allies than he did. He could still walk down the block and have little kids wave. He could still bring laughter to a kitchen table at midnight. But the stakes were no longer what they had been when he was a teenager hustling for pocket money. An indictment for pressuring a business owner didn't surprise him. It was a natural byproduct of his role. He fought the case, mocked it in front of friends, and then confronted the possibility that he would face a long stretch away. He told people he would use any downtime to read, to paint, to come back sharper. That wasn't just bravado. He genuinely liked ideas. He got along with people outside his world when they met him without prejudice. He believed he could reinvent himself, not by abandoning what made him powerful, but by redirecting it. That hope is something many people felt on his last birthday night. They had seen the restless kid from Brooklyn become a man who could light up a room, and they wanted to believe he could light up a different kind of room from then on. It's tempting to sum him up in one line, but lives are messy, and is more than most. He ran numbers. He loaned money at punishing rates. He used force to collect what he believed he was owed, and he stood accused, sometimes credibly, sometimes not, of arranging attacks on rivals. He did favors for neighbors no one else would help. He told big jokes, loved late dinners, cared about image, and ignored warnings that others would have taken seriously. He didn't see himself as a villain or a hero. He saw himself as a man who deserved his cut, and maybe a little more. That worldview created enemies. It also created a legend that the city still argues about. When the first phase of his war with the old boss reached its peak, he had already become a household name in the boroughs. Newspapers hinted, TV anchors smirked, and the public learned more mafia vocabulary in a year than they had in a decade. He stood in that light, half performer, half enforcer, bracing for the next move. Even bedtime stories can't make that tension cozy. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a city's lullaby underneath, the sound of a kid who grew up on crowded blocks, who learned to make himself seen, who walked toward power because he thought it would keep him safe. The city never guarantees safety. The kidnappings left a bruise on the city's underworld that didn't fade. Overnight, people who had sailed for years on the boss's calm found themselves sidelined. A jolt that proved the brothers were done asking nicely. Older figures who took loyalty oaths seriously shook their heads. Younger guys whispered that the map could be redrawn if you had the nerve. He didn't hide. He moved between Brooklyn spots with a certain ease, talking to shopkeepers, touching base with bookmakers, reminding people that the weekly collections would continue, that the clubhouses weren't closing, that friends would be protected. He also knew blowback would come. When you force the issue in a world that hates surprises, you spend every day braced for a response. It came in a way that made headlines because it felt like a scene out of a pulp novel. His older brother walked into a neighborhood bar for a sit-down and ended up fighting for breath on the floor while attackers looped a cord around him. A patrolman wandered in at the worst moment for the ambushers and the best for the target. The room scattered. His brother lived, shaken but alive, with deep marks around his throat, and a renewed belief that the other side would do anything. Names of suspects floated through the press, with one young enforcer singled out by reporters as a rising star on the opposite team. Prosecutors scurried, grand juries convened, and a case fizzled like so many street cases do when witnesses look at their shoes. The message, though, was received. That afternoon removed any illusion that this was still a family argument. It was a war for standing, revenue, and memory. The hostage drama fizzled too, in a way that stoked resentment. The captives had been released after promises that, on paper, sounded like a fresh start. Weeks passed, and suddenly those promises turned vague. The old boss didn't budge. Orders went out to reclaim rackets the brothers had marked as theirs. The jukebox routes, gaming dens, cigarette loads, and loan accounts at the core of their income became contested block by block. People who had accepted envelopes from one crew got quiet phone calls urging them to shift allegiance. Some did, some didn't, and some tried to pay both sides, until that stopped being an option. A neighborhood can absorb only so much tension before it snaps. He spent those months playing a constant shuttle run between diplomacy and intimidation. He would pop into a cafe and charm a worried owner from behind the counter, propose a reasonable figure, and make small talk about the owner's kids. At the next stop, if a collector had been snubbed or a driver roughed up, he could switch to ice. That blend made him both effective and dangerous. A few gnawing incidents pushed the war into darker territory. Close associates on both sides vanished after night meetings that were supposed to lead to peace. One in particular, an old pal known for his sweet tooth and loud laughter, stepped into the night to go fishing and never came back. It was the kind of disappearance that told every hanger-on this wasn't performative anymore. Police attention intensified. Detectives who had chased him for petty charges in the 50 seconds now tied him to a pattern of extortion and coercion. The case that stuck started small. A business owner who'd been pressed to pay weekly protection decided to talk. Court papers later described threats of smashed windows and silent men standing outside the shop until closing. The evidence wasn't cinematic, but it was solid enough. He was indicted, smirked for cameras on courthouse steps, and told friends the case would fall apart. It didn't. In 1962, a judge handed down a serious sentence. He was led away, not in swaggering victory, but in the slow shuffle that swallows even the most theatrical men once a door locks behind them. Prison did not dull his appetite for being interesting. He turned the yard and the library into stages. He read voraciously novels that probed power and fate, history books about revolutions, essays about freedom and responsibility. Guards and fellow inmates remembered him talking about ideas with the same intensity he once used to discuss a numbers route. He took up drawing and painting, sending rough canvases to friends with wry notes. He befriended people across lines that, on the street, rarely crossed. He played cards, told stories, and listened more than people expected. A man who had made his name in tight Brooklyn social circles started developing an outlook broader than his old neighborhood. His name, meanwhile, kept echoing beyond the walls. Family rivalries didn't pause just because he was away. His brothers sustained the President Street operations, enforcing loyalty and keeping money moving. The streets recorded a ledger of incidents: cars torched in the night, messages delivered by fists, and occasional gunfire that stopped traffic for minutes but kept funerals quiet. Reporters labeled it the Profaci War. Then the headline changed. The old boss died of cancer in 1962, and leadership passed to his longtime deputy. That man soon became entangled in a dangerous scheme that alarmed the commission, the League of Bosses who set rules from above. The scheme unraveled. The deputy withdrew. A younger capo with a knack for diplomacy and a smooth style was installed to restore peace and get the family off the front page. The new leader saw the stalemate as bad for business. He tried to soothe old wounds with meetings and offers that carved out areas for everyone to eat. The problem was trust. After the kidnappings, attempted strangling, trials, and broken promises, suspicion ran the show. The brothers didn't want crumbs. They wanted the core of what they believed they had earned back when they did dirty jobs for higher-ups. He watched it all from a cot, talking through glass to lawyers and friends. Word from the yard was that he told his people to be practical, to keep earning, to avoid reckless heroics that would whittle their numbers further. Quietly, he also began crafting a new self, one that didn't only belong to South Brooklyn but also to the clubs and salons that had once felt foreign. A handful of episodes during his sentence added to the legend. There were whispers that he had held court with radical thinkers who visited prisons, that he debated literature with teachers who didn't ask too many questions about his past, that he wrote a screenplay no one ever found. He began talking about making alliances his elders would have dismissed, reaching out across racial and ethnic lines in a way that made traditionalists nervous. He insisted that the world outside was changing, and any crew that refused to change would be left clinging to a shrinking corner. In a place where boredom crushes spirits, he made even boredom look like something you could bend to your will. All the while, official records listed the same kinds of charges at the heart of his reputation. Before his conviction, investigators had tied his name to loan sharking rings with punishing weekly vigs, to shakedowns that pushed vulnerable shopkeepers into paying for insurance, to hijackings of shipments that disappeared between a warehouse and a loading dock. Police reports connected his crew to assaults that sent rivals home with broken bones and bruised pride, and to kidnappings rare and risky that forced the hand of men who thought they couldn't be touched. Courts did not convict him of every allegation. Much of the life he led remained in the shadows because witnesses declined to talk or disappeared. Even so, the extortion case on his record ensured that when people later called him colorful, the color came with a dark border. Outside, the map shifted again. The new boss launched a public campaign that made newspapers swoon. A rights group that claimed to defend ordinary Italian Americans from stereotype, rallies that drew families and television cameras, speeches about dignity and opportunity. The move divided the streets. Some loved the new visibility, others thought the spotlight was poison. The brothers viewed it as theater and stayed skeptical. They kept their heads down, maintained rackets that hadn't been pried away, and let the calendar inch forward toward the day the middle brother would walk out and take back the reins. His personal life evolved too. The marriage he had entered years earlier would not survive the strain of lockup, the spotlight, and the changes in his taste. He remained affectionate in letters, then grew distant, a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched prison reshape a household. When he imagined the future, he pictured not only meetings in dim rooms and hushed phone calls, but also dinners with writers and actors, afternoons at galleries, a life that blended grit and culture. Some of that was image-making, some of it was real. He had always cared about presentation, and now he saw presentation as a kind of power distinct from force. By the late 1960 seconds, the war that began with kidnappings had cooled to an uneasy simmer. The new boss's mediating touch and the fatigue that follows years of strife helped. His own older brother would leave the stage too soon, not by street violence, but by a body that gave out earlier than expected. That loss altered the balance inside the crew and raised a question about who would project steadiness once the middle brother came home. The youngest brother was loyal and nimble. He would hold the line and keep the weekly engines running. Still, the absence of the eldest changed the room, and anyone who says otherwise didn't watch those three operate at full strength. The day he finally stepped onto the sidewalk again in 1971, New York had shifted under his feet. The skyline looked the same, but the neighborhoods felt different. Music blared from new speakers. Fashion had softened. The city had absorbed protest movements and cultural earthquakes. The boss who had taken power a few years earlier was now a public figure whose name appeared on posters and banners. He walked out thinner, sharper in his suits, smiling for photographers with an almost actorly ease. He went not to a back room first, but to restaurants where the city's creative set held court. He found new friends, actors, journalists, club owners, people who loved a story and understood that sitting next to him turned any meal into a headline. None of that meant he forgot his old job. Within days, he was back in Brooklyn, a familiar face on President Street, greeting old-timers, slapping backs, and letting it be known that his return was more than symbolic. He audited books, asked detailed questions about stalled numbers routes, checked on the jukebox splits, and met with bookies who had drifted. He made rounds in Manhattan, too, testing the idea that he could expand into areas where older families had long drawn lines. Friends say he talked about involving people who had never had a shot at meaningful positions, a break from custom that spooked men who thought the old rules were eternal. He also had to reckon with law enforcement's memory. Detectives never forgot high-profile players. Every step he took in those first months drew attention. He faced surveillance outside restaurants, traffic stops that turned into long chats on rainy curbs, and grand jury subpoenas that ate afternoons. Those weren't new to him, but in the 70 seconds the cameras were brighter. He leaned into the attention, offering quips that made reporters grin while saying little that could be quoted in court. For a man whose biggest skill was reading rooms, this was just another room. The money engines kept humming. Gambling remained a steady river of cash. Numbers runners got back on schedule. Jukebox and vending machine routes kept paying, though the coin-operated world was changing with the times. Loan accounts demanded steady pressure. He applied it with the mix of charm and steel that had always defined him. The new friends from the creative world saw a charismatic raconteur who loved the city at night. The old partners saw a boss determined to recover every inch he believed belonged to his crew. Both views were true. His past didn't stop haunting headlines. Journalists kept reviving the theory that he had helped remove a feared boss years earlier in a Midtown attack that became mob lore. He never confirmed it, and no court did either. He floated above the topic with a half smile. Whether or not he had a direct hand hardly mattered to his legend. The story positioned him as a person who didn't just ride waves, but made them. What did matter was the growing friction with the very leader who had promised peace. Public activism had put that leader in a spotlight no boss had ever sought. It culminated in a summer rally where gunshots tore through an open square, leaving the leader gravely wounded and the city stunned. Officials tracked a lone assailant, whose own ties were murky and debated for years. In the swirl that followed, whispers pointed in every direction. His name floated in that fog, not as an accused gunman, but as a beneficiary of the chaos, or an architect of the mood that made such a day possible. He denied involvement, laughed it off with reporters, and walked into restaurants where eyes followed him, as if answers might fall from his cuffs. By then, he was living a split life that he insisted could coexist. On a given afternoon, he might sketch in a notebook, talk about a play he wanted to write, and debate what made a great painting. That night, he would check on collections, weigh whether to absorb a small crew struggling in Queens, and approve a quiet message to a stubborn debtor. In both spaces, he was the same man, electric, attentive, certain of his instincts, and sure that he could bend fortune to his will. The risks of such certainty were as plain as the coffee in front of him, yet he treated risk like oxygen. He had done so since he was a boy running errands between bodega counters. It was who he was. When friends asked if the war was over, he shrugged. He said the city didn't do endings, only pauses. He treated each day like a negotiation with fate. Make enough good moves, and maybe fate gives you a little slack. He knew he had enemies, some in expensive suits and some in work shirts, some bitter over money and others angry about perceived disrespect. He also knew he had admirers, people who loved him because he made their block feel safer, because he slid cash across a table without being asked, because he remembered first names and details about their kids. Those opposed views weren't contradictions in his mind. They were the price of living large in a place that records everything and forgives very little. He had talked in prison about reinvention, about finding a path that relied less on fear and more on charm and creative work. After release, he tried to make those words real without abandoning the habits that made him powerful. That mix held for a year, a tightrope act performed in front of cameras and cops, writers and rivals, family and strangers. He seemed to enjoy the balance. For a short stretch, it felt like he might pull it off, keeping one foot in a past that shaped him and one in a future that tempted him. The city watched, fascinated, half expecting the wire to tremble. He threw himself into the city as if time owed him interest. Days started with coffee at a small spot in the village where writers traded gossip, then slid to Brooklyn for check-ins at old storefronts. He could hold a room without raising his voice, greeting grandmothers who remembered him as a skinny kid and young earners who only knew the stories. He had a new marriage, a stepchild who watched him with a mix of awe and confusion, and a circle that included actors, journalists, and painters who loved the rhythm of his talk. He surprised some people by how gently he handled ordinary moments waiting for a seat, tipping well, letting fans take a long second glance, then went back to work that depended on no one forgetting what his last name meant on certain blocks. Friends who had known him since the numbers days said the same thing in different words. Prison had not broken him, but it had widened his view. He still believed in loyalty, discretion, and the steady mechanics of collections. He also talked about scripts, canvases, and books with a curiosity that felt rare in his circle. He carried himself like someone who had learned to live in two languages at once. At night he could float from a club on West 52nd to a late dinner in Little Italy, and then to a dim parlor on President Street, shifting tone without missing a beat. The city, always hungry for characters, ate it up. What didn't change were the responsibilities that come with street power. He restarted gambling lines that had frayed during his absence, smoothed out vending and jukebox accounts, re-established contact with bookmakers who had wandered, and reminded bar owners which machines went where. People who owed were expected to meet their dates. People who had stalled got a second chance, sometimes a third if circumstances called for it. Behind the smile, deadlines still mattered. If a trucker needed to adjust a route, or a shopkeeper had doubts about a fee, he listened and then made sure the final answer stayed consistent. On paper, it was extortion. In practice, it was the same rough commerce that had defined those neighborhoods for decades. Courts would later call it coercion. Neighbors tended to call it the way things work. To understand why he refused to bend to the reigning order in his family even now, you have to return to the late 52nds, to a figure whose nickname told you exactly what business he ran. Frankie Schatz controlled a profitable numbers network in Red Hook and nearby streets. He was popular, connected, and a reliable earner for the top. When trouble gathered around him, an order came down for removal. The crew on President Street carried out that order in a neat, swift strike that startled people because it was so clean. In return, the brothers expected the roots that Frankie's empire fed every week. Instead, the leadership spread the prize around to other hands. The slight festered. The younger crew had bled for their chiefs and wanted a share that matched the risk. When it didn't come, resentment hardened into a philosophy. If respect isn't granted, create pressure until it is. From there, the spiral into open feud was fast. The hostage play in 1961, the seizure of ranking figures close to the throne, shattered an internal taboo. Among those targeted were names that carried real weight. One was the underboss, a man the rank and file feared to cross. Another was a senior capo whose word controlled busy corners. Taking them off the board even briefly signaled a new level of defiance. Promises followed, then drifted. The attempt on his older brother inside a dark bar, thwarted when a cop wandered into the wrong room at the perfect second, made everyone understand this was no longer an argument about splits. It was survival and status. Investigators suspected his crew in beatings, hijacks, and a series of disappearances tied to the struggle. He himself would end up in a cell on an extortion case brought by a shopkeeper who decided to talk, a rare thing in that world. He told people the years behind bars were productive. He read everything he could get. He practiced sketching and sent canvas boards out with notes that alternated between wry and sentimental. He argued with visiting teachers about what justice meant and tested his ideas on fellow inmates with very different backgrounds. Rumors painted him in almost theatrical terms, holding court with radicals, plotting a screenplay, turning weight room acquaintances into future business contacts. What is certain is that he came home with broader friendships, a sense of how the world outside had changed, and a conviction that old boundaries inside New York's underworld lines drawn on blood and birthplace were turning brittle. That conviction collided with a fact no one could ignore. The man at the top of his family had turned himself into a public crusader. Joe Colombo's league-filled plazas and upset federal agents by calling attention to surveillance tactics. Families took kids to the rallies. Television covered it with a blend of curiosity and skepticism. From the viewpoint of older bosses, all those cameras looked like an invitation for scrutiny. From the viewpoint of rank-and-file Italian Americans trying to keep jobs and dignity, the league looked like a proud stand. He observed the spectacle with a mix of contempt and practical worry. Publicity attracts heat. Heat brings indictments. Indictments tighten the purse. When the activist boss was shot at a rally in 1970, and left clinging to life, 100 whispers hit the pavement at once. Some suspected that rivals inside the old commission had engineered a message. Others, noting his friendships across racial lines, tried to pin the blame on him by insinuation. He denied it, and never wavered from that denial. No court tied him to it. The case never reached a satisfying conclusion, and the uncertainty became part of the city's myth. After that day, the family's leadership sat in an uneasy arrangement of acting bosses and advisors trying to preserve order and revenue. He read that room quickly. Chaos is opportunity, but mishandled, opportunity becomes a trap. He stepped lightly, reasserted his hold over loyal earners, and pressed for a new settlement that recognized what he and his crew had built years earlier. For a little while, a version of that settlement seemed reachable. Then the pushback began. Old enemies hardened their positions. Meetings about peace ended with dead smiles. He kept showing up in restaurants and clubs, laughing with entertainers, tossing off lines that showed how close he was to the city's glitter, while never forgetting that men he had crossed still wanted to block his rise, or worse, he had help. The youngest brother, loyal to a fault, ran day-to-day duties with the steady pace of a man who knew every stoop and doorway in South Brooklyn. A sharp lieutenant with a boxer's build, nicknamed for the way he hit without warning, served as the middle link between orders and action. They kept collectors honest, guarded the number runners, and made sure no storefront went unvisited. Their earnings came from old standbys, gambling, loans, stolen loads, vending, club services. Police reports from those months mentioned intimidation, designed to keep a hesitant client from switching sides, quiet assaults that ended in hospital visits, but rarely formal complaints, and a handful of hijacks executed with a precision that suggested inside information. He never put those plans on paper. He didn't have to. This was a world where instructions were delivered by glance and pattern. Reporters hung on his quips. He obliged them with jokes that said nothing and everything. He cut a striking figure in suits that fit like armor, hair slick, eyes bright. He glided into places that used to shut their doors to men from his background. Creative types embraced him as a walking contradiction, an underworld voice who could talk art, a man known for hard tactics who cried at the right movie. He leaned into that paradox without apology. Some of it was performance, some of it was sincere. He loved the city's energy and knew that being seen beside stars made him harder to box in. At the same time, that visibility gave critics ammunition to say he had gone soft, or that he believed headlines could protect him from retaliation. He brushed off the warnings. He had spent years surviving in tighter corners. Marriage added a layer of calm to the chaos. He doted on his wife and stepdaughter, tried to shield them from the harsher parts of his day, and instituted an odd routine of mixing family with nightlife dinners that began at a show and ended much later at a place where collectors came to pay respects. He carried himself as a man who wanted to straddle two worlds, and believed he could. For a few months, it worked. He checked accounts in the afternoons, sought introductions for a possible book deal in the evenings, and took meetings after midnight that reminded everyone the Gallo name still had bite. Police pressure intensified in those months by design. Special units tracked his movements, recorded plates, and leaned on associates. He faced old charges turned into new summonses: harassment, conspiracy, unlawful possession. When a car stop turned up a weapon he insisted he didn't know about. He made bail when he had to, stayed smooth in front of flashbulbs, never mentioned business in a room he didn't control, and told reporters to spell his name right. Behind the show he took precautions. Different routes, different tables, a habit of reading a room twice before sitting down. Even the best instincts, though, can miss the one variable that matters. On the criminal ledger, the picture of his life by this stage was fairly clear to anyone who read court files. He had a conviction for extortion that cost him most of his 30s, tied to a business owner who described threats if payments weren't made. Police connected his crew to loan operations that charged weekly percentages high enough to trap debtors for months, if not years. Reports linked him to truck hijackings in which goods disappeared between loading docks and warehouse doors. There were allegations of assaults aimed at keeping rivals from infringing on vending and jukebox territory, and of kidnappings used to force a settlement in the old family dispute. He denied arranging the worst of it, as he always did, and prosecutors couldn't prove many of the rumors. Still, the pattern is hard to miss. He built power by understanding human fear and human need, and by making sure people felt both in proportion that favored him. In public, he softened edges. He greeted kids on the stoop, remembered birthdays, and made a point of visiting families who had fallen behind, as if to show that life under his watch could be predictable. He loved animals and played up the old stories about exotic pets that had prowled a back room years earlier, letting the legend swirl without confirming every detail. He told friends that he would finance a play, or write one, or at least turn a chapter of his life into a cautionary tale that could pay everyone at the table. He was not naive about where his money came from. He simply believed he could convert charisma into a better future. Charisma had carried him through rooms where stronger bodies failed. He trusted it. The months leading up to spring felt almost calm from the outside. He had reset old arrangements, built new ones, and sketched a future that blended entertainment and business. Even as the Colombo world simmered, he moved as if a truce existed, or could be willed into existence by steady income and goodwill. The acting figures who managed the family after their leader's shooting had other ideas. They worried his reach was growing, and that his popularity with civilians made him harder to corner. Quietly, contingency plans formed on both sides: what to do if peace held, what to do if it broke. He was aware of the risk. Men who live as long as he did in that ecosystem know the math. He told a friend he would never see 50, then laughed it away and ordered another round. He scheduled meetings he had put off for months and took his wife to the places he had promised to show her, as if stocking up on bright memories. The city was swelling with new energy again. Movies about gangsters filled theaters, a team in Queens made fans dream, and the spring air made even old corners look new. He walked through it all like a person for whom the city itself had been a lifelong stage. On his 43rd birthday, he dressed with care, collected a small party, and made an evening of it show first, then a late bite where the room would feel friendly. He hadn't lost his habit of changing seats to watch the door and the sidewalk. He retained the superstition of touching a piece of silver before an important talk. He laughed more than usual that night and tipped more than usual. It was the kind of birthday that makes an onlooker say a man is entering a new chapter, that the lesson of prison, patience, reinvention, breadth had finally rewritten his habits. The people who loved him wanted to believe it. The people who feared him suspected he was gathering strength in plain view. The picture of him at that moment, in that glowing spring, is complicated and therefore true. He was a career racketeer with a long record of coercive tactics. A man whose crew had been linked to hijacks, enforced loans, and violent pressure when soft words failed. He was also a magnetic figure who treated waiters kindly, who read deeply, who dreamed of films and books, and who saw in New York not just a map of rackets, but a beautiful machine that could be navigated with wit and nerve. He does not fit into a neat category, and anyone who tries to shove him into one misses the point of how men like him come to be. The streets made him. Prison changed him. Fame tempted him. Enemies tracked him. Friends adored him. He believed until the very last hour that he could keep those currents from colliding. The night began with jokes sharp enough to slice the smoke in the room. A comic worked the stage at a midtown club, teasing anyone in reach, tossing barbs that made tablemates clutch their stomachs. He loved that kind of talk. The verbal fencing, the way a quick line could flip a room. He sat with friends from both sides of his life, actors with easy laughter. A writer who loved a good anecdote. Neighborhood faces who had known him before fame scuffed the edges. The actor everyone recognized from television and Broadway gave him a hug on the way out, wished him many more birthdays, and headed home with his wife. He stayed longer, soaking in the applause, the white tablecloths, the feeling that, for once, celebration outran worry. Past 4 inches the morning, the party drifted to a small seafood spot in Little Italy, a corner joint that welcomed late eaters and night workers ending their shifts. His wife sat close, stepdaughter beside her, a few friends in tow, including the loyal bodyguard who never seemed to sleep. Plates hit the table, clams, pasta, bread still warm from the oven. He liked the energy there at that hour, a mix of cooks yelling orders, doormen trading stories outside, and the lasting hum of a city that refuses to shut down. He ordered lightly, laughed with the waiters, and dabbed sauce from his cuff with a napkin-like style mattered even at dawn. The trouble reached them quickly, and without ceremony. A man stepped in from the sidewalk, raised a hand that wasn't there to shake, and let the room know the feud he had tried to outmaneuver had followed him to his birthday table. He pushed back his chair, moved to draw the threat away from his wife and the child, and headed toward the door. The air cracked. He made the sidewalk in a rush, still moving, a stubborn act of will as much as instinct. His friend from Greece, quick on reflex, reached for what he carried, and answered fire with fire until the assailant and his backup darted to a waiting car and vanished down Mulberry. Sirens arrived fast. Flashbulbs followed. The meal sat cooling on a table that nobody would clear for hours. At the hospital, the bright white lights and quiet voices had none of the drama of a club. Doctors worked by routine. Officers took names. Family clutched each other in the hallway and stared at the clock. Before sunrise, the night had turned into a headline. By morning, people were reading about a killing that felt at once inevitable and surreal, as if a man who courted attention had finally found a crowd that wouldn't applaud. His age made the story sharper. 43 is young in every universe. The photographs that ran that day displayed him smiling in a silk tie, eyes dancing, as if the paper wanted readers to feel the contrast between a glamorous surface and a hard reality. Detectives moved in quick circles, interviewing everyone who had shared the table, pulling security notes from nearby businesses, running down plates that matched hastily written notes. The bodyguard said what he saw and held his ground under hours of questions. Officers built a tentative timeline. A birthday night that started in Midtown, company that dwindled after the show, a detour to the village, and a final stop at the Little Italy spot because a friend was hungry. It fit the casual way he moved through the city, making late plans by feel. Ballistics offered patterns, but names were what the papers wanted. That's where the fog rolled in. The old feud explained motive without naming a particular hand. He had crossed powerful figures years earlier when he and his brothers seized members of the top circle to force better terms. He had refused to bend after a promised settlement dissolved, and he had returned from prison with a public profile that annoyed men who preferred quiet. The shooting of the activism-minded boss at a summer rally the year before had deepened divisions. It left loyalists angry, searching for villains in every shadow. He denied any part in that incident, and the official inquiry never put him behind it. Still, if you asked a corner in Brooklyn who might want him gone, you didn't need to pass out questionnaires. Months later, a low-level figure tied to the opposing side walked into federal offices and tried to ease his own fear by talking. He said he had been near the restaurant, that he had alerted higher-ups when he spotted the birthday group, that a small team had gone over, one man firing while others covered. He named names. Investigators wrote everything down and chased every lead. The case didn't land in a courtroom with a defendant and a verdict the public could memorize. The most believable version of events came from overlapping accounts rather than a single clean confession. That hazy ending suited a world that keeps its secrets until everyone who knows them has left the stage. Another theory, splashier and harder to prove, surfaced years later when a union enforcer from another city claimed in a memoir that he had been the triggerman. He described a walk across the street, a split-second decision, a clean escape on foot. Historians and former law enforcement officials doubted big parts of his tale, citing distances, angles, and details that didn't square with the earliest reports. The argument became part of the larger debate over how myths attach to famous crimes. In a sense, competing stories hardened his legend. People choose the version that fits the picture of him they prefer: iconoclast cut down by rivals, lawless figure meeting a predictable fate, or chess player caught by one move he didn't see. His wife spoke to the press with a blend of grief and insistence. She said he had planned a different life, that he had real friends outside his old crew, that he wanted to turn his charm into work that wouldn't bring squads to the door. She remembered the gentle habits that didn't make police files. Rescuing strays, reading late, encouraging her daughter's school efforts, treating people in service jobs with unusual respect. Later, she wrote about the marriage, making the point that a person can be two things at once: tender at home and terrifying on the street. Her account annoyed some in his old circle who felt she sanded down parts of him. It also put a human face on a story that the city had turned into a crime saga. The funeral drew crowds that showed the range of his world. Tough men in dark coats stood shoulder to shoulder with artists and writers who wanted one last look. The line of cars crawled past blocks that had seen him as a teenager, and then a headline. Priests murmured the same prayers they say for every soul. Outside, microphones hovered. Reporters sought quotes from anyone who had shared a cigarette with him in a hallway. In death as in life, he remained interesting. That was one of his gifts and one of his curses. Back on the street, the struggle that had defined his final years did not stop. Retaliation followed the familiar script of that era: ambushes in parking lots, sudden attacks near club doors, messages delivered with fists or bullets, and then swallowed by the code of silence. Some targets lived to tell friends what they thought had happened. Others did not return home. The police department created special units to track the violence. Federal agents convened grand juries. Indictments landed. Trials stumbled. Without cooperative witnesses, the justice system mostly recorded the turbulence without ending it. His brother stepped into the vacuum with the steadiness he had shown before. He managed collections, kept earner morale high, and tried to build alliances that would lower the temperature. A few years into that phase, the war's fatigue and pressure from higher councils led to an unusual solution. The remaining crew would no longer operate under the family they had battled. Instead, by arrangement at the highest level, they would be absorbed into a different organization with which they had long maintained quiet ties. That transfer ended the most explosive chapter of the conflict. Old beefs never truly vanish, but structure softens personal rancor when everybody's income depends on it. In telling his life, it's important to keep the crimes clear and the temptations of glamour at arm's length. He built power through the bread and butter rackets of mid-20th century New York. He ran numbers illegal lotteries that skimmed small sums from thousands of bets. He controlled routes for jukeboxes and vending machines, a business that seems quaint until you realize how much cash flows through coins and how enforcement of those routes worked. He loaned money at steep interest and enforced repayment with pressure that could escalate to violence. He greenlit hijackings that took goods off trucks between loading dock and destination, a theft that punished companies with poor security and rewarded crews with the right phone calls. He used force to protect territory, a portfolio of assaults that sent stubborn rivals to hospital beds and cooperative rivals to tables where new deals got drawn. Some of the biggest allegations surrounding him belong in a separate column marked "Contested." Prosecutors and reporters long suggested he had a role in removing the fearsome head of a rival outfit in a midtown barbershop years earlier. Those whispers named his unit as support or muscle. Others said different hitmen handled that notorious job. No court settled the point. Another allegation, more grounded, tied his team to the 1,959 removal of a neighborhood numbers boss, an act carried out to please superiors and to clear a path to lucrative business. That event matters less for proving how ruthless he could be. We already know that, and more for explaining why he felt so betrayed when rewards didn't flow as promised. Without that grudge, there is no rebellion, no kidnappings, no long war. The cultural afterlife snowballed in ways he might have enjoyed. The city's best-known columnist used him as a model for a comic novel about gangsters who bungle everything. The book became a film while he was away. A then-rising songwriter later penned a sprawling ballad that painted him as a doomed rebel, stacking verses with scenes of loyalty and betrayal. The song drew criticism for turning a violent racketeer into a folk hero, and praise for capturing the romance of a doomed attempt to break a corrupt mold. Artists and filmmakers kept returning to him because he contained contradictions they could stretch into drama. A man who read poets and arranged shakedowns, who charmed celebrities and terrorized rivals, who walked his wife's daughter to school, and returned at night to meetings where fear had a seat. The spot where he fell became a kind of pop landmark. Tourists wandered by at lunchtime and took photos. Guides told fast versions of the story between stops for cannoli. Restaurants rose and fell. The block itself kept doing what New York blocks do, changing outfits without changing its walk. Older locals rolled their eyes at all the romance, remembering that behind the anecdotes were men who got hurt, families who lost earners, businesses that paid when they couldn't afford to, and neighborhoods that lived under a set of rules no one had voted for. Law enforcement's final accounting of his career was by necessity incomplete. Records showed arrests for coercive practices, a serious conviction for extortion that sent him away for a long stretch, and an array of lesser charges that came with his line of work: illegal weapons, harassment, conspiracy. Files tied his closest associates to beatings, kidnappings during the internal dispute, property damage aimed at persuasion, and the logistics of theft from commercial shipments. These were the frameworks of a criminal enterprise, not isolated misdeeds. Yet even those files, dense as they are, don't capture the full texture of how he kept people in line. The smiles, the favors, the threats wrapped in jokes, the ability to make defiance feel impolite. What set him apart wasn't only nerve. Plenty of men in that world had nerve. It was his appetite for the larger stage. He liked cameras, or at least didn't mind them. He liked strange new company. He wanted to prove that a man from President Street could sit at any table in Manhattan and act like he belonged. He believed charisma was a tool as powerful as force, and he wielded both without apology. That combination thrilled people who loved big personalities and worried pragmatists who thought the extra light would burn him. In the end, the spotlight did not kill him. The feud did, but the spotlight ensured that people would talk about him long after most street figures fade into footnotes. There's a temptation when telling his story to smooth out the edges, to pick either the man who handed out cash to neighbors in trouble, or the man who sent debtors into the kind of fear that ends sleep. The truth is the overlap. He could be generous and ruthless, curious and domineering, affectionate and unforgiving. Those paired traits did not cancel each other. They made him effective in a place where people respond as much to warmth as to warning. They also made him vulnerable to a final act played by rules he could not rewrite. New York nurtured him, sharpened him, applauded him, and then did what it always does: kept moving. His death did not end discussion of his choices. Writers, historians, former investigators, and old neighbors still argue about whether he might have reinvented himself fully if he had been given more time. Some point to his reading, his friendships across lines, his quieter afternoons sketching and talking film. Others note the hard facts of what paid his bills and the speed with which he reassembled his crew after parole. Both positions carry weight. He was changing, but he was also staying the same. The tension between those forces gives his story its lasting pull. For people who grew up on those blocks, the memory that lingers is simpler. He was the kid who would take a dare, the teenager who learned to collect, the young man who refused to bow, the boss who walked into any room like he owned the clock, the husband who tried to create a softer home, and the figure whose last night is still retold in the glow of late dinners. He left behind the ledger of a career built on fear and need, and the outline of a life that reached beyond its ledger. That's not praise or blame. It's the shape of what happened. Detectives spent weeks pulling at threads that frayed in their hands. Witnesses repeated what they could without stepping over lines that might haunt them later. The closest friend at the table held to his account, describing a pair of men quick and focused, who slipped from view as fast as they'd appeared. A small-time earner from the other side tried to save himself by telling agents he had tipped off higher-ups when he noticed the birthday group walking in. He named a few who allegedly waited in the neighborhood, then scurried into protection. None of it led to a jury hearing a single, complete version. The killing belonged to the category that New York understands all too well. Everyone knows why, few can say who, and the calendar does the rest. What happened next looked like the closing movement of a long, sour symphony. The men still loyal to his line moved with the same mix of swagger and caution they'd learned under him. One evening, a pair of adversaries were caught unaware outside a club and beaten until they forgot the idea of claiming a certain vending account. Another night, a car parked too near a favored hangout went up in a quick orange bloom that ruined the block's sleep. Shots answered shots. Most of the wounded refused to identify anyone. When the fever didn't break, men above the fight stepped in. You can't collect steady envelopes while crews are taking cover. Quiet talks led to an arrangement that surprised the neighborhoods but made sense to the people who count. The remaining President Street outfit would shift to a different banner. Old quarrels don't die, but a new jersey cools them down. Reporters printed the transfer as a footnote. On the street, it felt like a truce signed in pencil. The youngest brother kept the core team tight and busy. A trusted aide handled meetings in Manhattan, where nightlife money flowed differently but just as reliably. Collections resumed their rhythm. Numbers runners hit their marks. The jukebox and vending network that once paid for a dozen households still fed the crew, though now it did so with a fresh set of supervisors above them. A few diehards muttered about pride. Most were relieved to return to the dependable cycle that keeps a roof paid for and a kitchen stocked. Looking backward from that moment clarifies the path that led there. Years before the removal of the neighborhood's big numbers, man had reshaped the map. His name fit the racket he ran. He'd been a favorite of the old boss because he paid on time and kept the peace. When that protection thinned, the order went out to erase him. People close to the case would later trace the job to the President Street team. They carried it out in brisk fashion, and afterward they expected the roots that fed the numbers bank to become theirs. Instead, pieces were handed to other hands. In a world where status and revenue are fused, that snub burned. It produced the kidnappings in 1961, senior figures seized quietly in back rooms and made to sit while new terms were discussed. Promises were made, then rescinded. The failed strangling of the eldest brother at a bar soon afterward confirmed that the dispute had crossed into blood. During those early years, a darker rumor stitched itself to his legend. A powerful leader from another family was cut down in a midtown shop, an attack that became underworld lore. Talkers at bars said the President Street boys had a role. Some swore they didn't. Police never proved it. History split on the point. What mattered to his reputation was that the rumor stuck hard enough to change how men in other boroughs looked at him as a potential player in high-level moves, not just a neighborhood bully. With that came both opportunity and risk. The extortion case that sent him away started with a shopkeeper, tired of looking over his shoulder. Investigators recorded calls, noted patterns, and wrote a story a jury could follow. A judge set a sentence long enough to cover his 30s. He went in with a grin and a cigar, and set about learning how to live inside routine. He read, argued, drew, and traded tales, until the guards who'd thought they knew his type realized this version had edges that didn't match the stereotype. He liked ideas. He also understood the arithmetic of fear. The years didn't soften him. They gave him time to refine how he moved through a room. Free again in 1971, he stitched together a split life that only a few can manage for long. Afternoons belonged to the mechanics of rackets, routes, payouts, disputes over a tavern's machines. Evenings swung toward a world that operated by applause and reviews. He met actors who liked a good story, and journalists who knew that a table with him could become copy. He married in a quick, warm ceremony and tried to build a household where a stepchild could feel safe. He spoke about writing something honest, about turning his strange mix of reading and street lessons into a project that wouldn't invite a detective to the door. He almost made that balance look natural. Underneath the theater, the criminal record remained what it was. He drew income from illegal gambling, the numbers racket especially. He enforced vending and jukebox territories with a range of techniques that started with a talk and, if necessary, escalated. He oversaw loan operations that charged punishing weekly percentages, a cycle that trapped debtors who fell behind. He benefited from hijackings of trucks that never reached their destinations. Those loads, liquor, cigarettes, garments, moved through channels that had been set in Brooklyn since the war. Police files stapled his name to assaults tied to territorial disputes, to the pressure applied during the hostage phase of the internal fight, to intimidation designed to keep small businesses paying for protection. Courts didn't convict him for every suspected act. In that world, they almost never do. The extortion conviction stands as the formal marker of a career that otherwise lived in the shadows. After the Little Italy night, the city turned him into a story it could carry from decade to decade. The novelist with a gift for comic crime wrote a book about bumbling gangsters that all but named him. The film version arrived while he was still gone, turning his feuds into farce. A few years later, a songwriter spun a long ballad that treated him as a doomed rebel, a romantic trapped in a trade that would not forgive him. Critics fumed about dressing up rough business as poetry. Others said the song captured a truth about how men like him get caught between aspiration and habit. He had become a mirror onto which listeners could project what they wanted to see. A brave misfit, a reckless predator, a neighborhood original, a tragic figure whose skills worked everywhere except the one place that mattered. His widow's voice added texture that police records can't. She told of late-night reading, of tenderness at small moments, of a man who helped strangers when no one was looking, of a dream to turn away from the old games. She also acknowledged the gravity of his choices and the way danger followed them into restaurants and through front doors. People who had worked under him recognized parts of her portrait and rejected others. The argument over how to measure him never settled, and probably never will. He lived an overlapping life. Generous and hard. Curious and domineering. Impulsive and deliberate. One detail about his earlier years kept resurfacing in interviews with old-timers on the block. The candy store that doubled as a clubhouse. Kids bought sweets and comics at the counter. In back, men talked business in whispers. He learned the craft there, who to trust, how to separate a bluff from a real threat, when to give a debtor an extra week, and when to end the discussion. The myth says there was once a lion cub sprawling in the office as a prop and a dare. Whether that's factual or simply the kind of boast a neighborhood loves, the story spread because it felt like him. Theatrical, unpredictable, a bit of show glued to a lot of nerve. His openness to crossing old lines set him apart. In prison, he talked with men from backgrounds that the old neighborhood kept at arm's length. On release, he kept some of those friendships, inviting people to dinners where they wouldn't otherwise have been welcome. According to allies and to his wife, he wanted to build a crew that reflected that openness, both as a practical tactic and as a belief about the city's future. Traditionalists recoiled. They preferred the oldest circles and the oldest rules. That difference in instinct fed the suspicion that shadowed him after the shooting at the summer rally, when a gunman from outside the Italian underworld fired into the crowd. He denied any role in that day's planning. The investigation never tied him to it. Still, the way he moved arms open, categories blurred, made it easy for enemies to whisper. Law enforcement learned conflicting lessons from his career. One was that visibility can be a gift. A man who enjoys the spotlight gives you a calendar and a route map. Another was that charm is evidence of nothing. He could leave a room of journalists smiling without saying anything you could use in court. Detectives chased rumors, flipped small fish, and once in a while gathered enough to file papers that stuck. Most of the time, though, they watched a familiar cycle. Arrests without cooperation, grand juries without courage, trials without the one witness who could explain the missing hour. After his death, they filed the case in the drawer where so many carefully built files end up. The crew's shift to a new sponsor calmed things. The youngest brother and his remaining lieutenants continued to do what they knew. Keep the weekly income steady, mediate disputes before fists flew, and let bigger bosses worry about long-range strategy. The move also protected them from the worst of the old feud, which had swallowed too many years and too much blood. A few of the rivals who had celebrated after the Little Italy night ran out of luck in the next couple of seasons. Cost comes due, late or early. The city noticed the smaller headlines, then moved on. A walk through the places he loved reveals what doesn't change and what does. President Street still carries echoes of chairs scraped across a clubhouse floor. Little Italy still hosts late meals and tourists hunting legends. The village still offers tables where artists argue until the chairs go up. He threaded those spaces by instinct. A man who could turn a doorstep into a stage. What he built rested on fear and habit, on the comforting rhythm of envelopes delivered and ledgers balanced. What he imagined in his last year looked like something else. A life where his knack for holding a room paid without demanding that someone else pay more. That second idea faced a stubborn fact. The first was the only skill set he had mastered all the way through. There's a final ledger worth scanning, one that puts the glamour in proportion to the consequences. Small businesses under his sway paid money they could have used for other needs. Debtors carried worry from breakfast to bedtime. Truckers learned to drive routes with an eye on mirrors. Rivals limped home from fights they didn't think they'd started. Police worked overtime on cases that never truly ended. Families prayed for sons to pick safer trades. At the same time, neighbors remembered envelopes slid across tables when rent was due, holiday turkeys delivered without a request, a sense of order that, however costly, made certain corners feel predictable. Both truths belong in the retelling. His story continues to pull because it sits at the crossroads of power and performance. He wanted to be more than an earner. He wanted to be seen, to be understood, to be liked by people far from his first circle. He got part of that wish and paid the bill he must have known was coming. What followed, the slow sorting of fact from myth, the long shadow cast over his block, the arguments about whether he could have changed for good, belongs to a city that loves characters and forgives inconsistently. He became one of those characters. He also became a caution, a reminder that charm can carry you into any room except the one where consequences wait. Years later, when someone mentions his name in a Brooklyn bar, the response is still split. An older man talks about a favor he did for a neighbor who'd lost a job. A woman who ran a shop remembers the quiet dread of Fridays. A retired detective shrugs and says he was better company than most men he chased. A writer says the story practically tells itself. The truth weaves through those versions. He was a product of the streets that taught him and the era that rewarded nerve. He broke rules inside his own world and refused to bow when he felt slighted. He committed crimes that bruised his city and cultivated a warmth that complicated every judgment about him. That is where the life lands. After all the debate on a balance beam that never stops wobbling, he reached for reinvention and kept a hand on the old rails. He made enemies who waited and friends who still missed the spark he carried into a room. He believed attention was armor, then learned it isn't. He trusted his instincts, and they carried him almost all the way. The rest became legend. Which is to say, a story New York will keep telling as long as it tells stories. In the months that followed the Little Italy night, the story hardened into a rhythm the city recognized. Detectives chased shadows. Prosecutors waited for a witness to stop glancing at the floor. Reporters fed a public that couldn't look away. The closest friend at the table kept repeating what he'd said from the first hour, that a pair of men arrived with purpose, that the shooter moved fast, that he returned fire as they ran for the door. A neighborhood associate from the other side walked into federal offices and tried to trade information for safety. He said he had spotted the birthday group, alerted higher-ups, and watched as a small team slipped toward the seafood place. He named names that meant something on the street. None of it produced a clean courtroom ending. The strongest account came from overlapping statements, not a single confession strong enough to survive cross-examination. New York filed the case in the same thick drawer that holds so many unsettled acts. A place where everyone understands why, but no one can stamp who. While law enforcement worked through the motions, the map of his old world shifted. Violence had a way of ruining business, and business is what kept the lights on. So the men above the feud did what they always do when a fight drags on too long. They rebalanced. The remaining President Street crew, run by the youngest brother and anchored by a few steady lieutenants, moved under a different flag by agreement at the top. That transfer ended daily hostilities. Pride softened when reliable money replaced uncertainty. Collections resumed their quiet rhythm. Numbers, runners returned to routes. Vending and jukebox splits were counted, without the fear that a rival would appear at closing. Old grudges didn't vanish, but order dulled them. Looking back through his career from that calmer vantage puts the charges against him in focus. He began with larceny and small rackets in his teens bar fights, possession of tools meant for break-ins, habits that pulled him step by step from the line of ordinary work. He moved quickly into the numbers trade, the underground lottery that braided together thousands of tiny bets taken at candy stores, diners, and barbershops. The numbers bank that collected the day's take required muscle and bookkeeping in equal measure. He brought both. As his crew grew, he added jukebox and vending routes that turned nickels into paydays. Those routes mattered because cash flowed daily, and because the boxes sat in public, visible reminders of who ran a block. He kept them in place with the familiar sequence: a polite request, a firm reminder, and, if necessary, a lesson that stopped short of lasting injury, but left no doubt. Hijacking shipments became another stream. Clothes, liquor, cigarettes, small appliances, anything that rode a truck, and could vanish between a loading dock and a warehouse counted as opportunity. His crew preferred strikes that didn't raise alarms, the sort that left drivers and loaders alive to work another day and say little. The goods moved through fences whose names never hit the papers and whose profits fed the same circle that banked numbers and split jukebox proceeds. Police reports in those years traced patterns of missing cargo to crews tied to him. Courts rarely saw the cases, because links are hard to prove unless someone inside breaks. Loans filled out the portfolio. If a shopkeeper needed cash or a gambler fell short, envelopes appeared with smiling terms and punishing weekly percentages. Paying on time kept collectors friendly. Falling behind invited pressure that escalated from conversation to a rough warning. He ran those operations like a ledger, with due dates, penalties, and special consideration when a debtor had value in other ways. The law calls that loan sharking. On the block, people called it borrowing from men you didn't want to disappoint. Two specific acts shaped everything that followed. In 1959, the neighborhood number's boss, whose nickname matched his business, was removed in a neat, efficient strike. He had paid the old hierarchy well and kept the streets calm. When he went down, the prize control of a vast betting network should have made the crew that took the risk rich for years. Instead, the top spread the roots around to maintain balance. That decision lit the fuse. His crew had done the job and wanted the spoils. They didn't get them. The second moment arrived 2 years later, when he and his brothers seized key figures close to the throne, the underboss, a trusted captain, and colleagues of similar rank, and demanded new terms. The ploy broke a taboo inside their world. Pressure yielded promises but not lasting change. The retaliation that followed, including the attempt to strangle his older brother during a bar meeting, interrupted by a patrolman's sudden entry, guaranteed that there would be no easy way out. The list of contested accusations often starts with a midtown killing that became legend. The top man from another family cut down in a shop, a scene so public that its echoes have never faded. Rumors put his crew near the planning. Others point elsewhere. No court settled it. He never confirmed a connection. The story clung to him anyway, and with it the perception that he played in moves larger than his block. Another allegation, more grounded, tied him to the disappearance of a rival loyalist during the internal war, a man known by a nickname that sounded like Candy. He reportedly left for a late meeting and did not return. Street accounts have him taken, questioned, and eliminated. Bodies didn't surface. Families grieved in private. The code kept official records thin. His criminal record on paper was clearer. In 1961 and 1962, an extortion case built by patient detectives and a shopkeeper willing to speak reached a courtroom. Jurors heard about threats wrapped in polite words, about men who lingered on sidewalks until a decision got made, about payments collected according to a schedule that no bank recognized but everyone in that part of Brooklyn understood. He was convicted and sent away for a stretch that covered most of his 30s. The sentence didn't break him. He adapted. He read history, novels, and philosophy. He drew and painted, sending small canvases to friends with notes that alternated between tender and sardonic. He talked across racial and ethnic lines, making friends that the older neighborhood considered strange. He told people he planned to change course when he got out, to relocate his talent for holding a room into spaces where applause replaced fear. He came home in 1971, with that ambition intact, and with the old instincts ready to fire. He reset gambling lines, restored vending routes, and reminded every business owner who had drifted during his absence what their arrangements had been before. He also stepped into a new circle, meeting actors, columnists, and club owners who found him irresistible as a character. A quick marriage followed. A stepchild entered his life, and witnesses from that period remember how soft he could be with her, helping with schoolwork, shielding her from late-night drama, even as he stepped out to meetings that paid bills the legitimate way never had. He said he would write, maybe produce something for the stage. He was trying to assemble a life that honored both sides of his nature. The city around him was in flux. The family he had battled had installed a boss who stepped into the public square with a rights group that attracted television and families in equal measure. He saw risk in that spotlight. The summer rally that ended in gunfire and left that leader gravely wounded deepened fractures. Some whispered that his openness to alliances beyond the old lines made him a suspect in spirit, if not in fact. He denied any involvement, and investigators never linked him to that day. Suspicion and politics moved faster than proof. In the year that followed, he lived with those eyes on him, and with the knowledge that the other side might treat him as a symbol, not just a rival. The night he died tied all those strands together, public life touching private life, a decade of grudges converging at one table. His case never generated convictions. One witness from the rival side, lower on the ladder, claimed to have spotted him and alerted figures in the neighborhood. He named a triggerman who died soon after. He drifted into protection. Another man, a union enforcer from another city, claimed years later that he had been the assassin. His account captured imaginations but faltered under scrutiny. People still argue about which version feels right. The uncertainty keeps the story alive, a quality he would have understood. His death widened the gap between legend and ledger. On one side, you have the list: extortion, loan sharking, control of gambling operations, hijacks, assaults to defend territory, kidnappings during the internal fight, and suspected roles in removals that shifted power. On the other side, you have the qualities that made him famous beyond his block: quick wit, a taste for books and art, friendships across lines, small kindnesses to neighbors in trouble, an ability to turn a room lively with a gesture. Both sides are true. One paid for suits and dinners and influence. The other turned him into a character bigger than his earnings. Law enforcement changed approaches in the wake of men like him. Prosecutors leaned harder into conspiracy charges that didn't rely on a single reluctant witness. Wiretaps became more common. Patience, more valued. The old method, waiting for one frightened shopkeeper to carry a case, rarely worked. In that sense, his career helped teach the city how to investigate the rackets he had mastered. It also taught reporters and artists what kinds of stories audiences wanted from their city's underbelly. Tales that balanced charm and menace, that avoided pornographic detail while making plain the cost of fear. Walk the streets he walked, and pieces of him are still visible, if you know where to look. A storefront that once served numbers players has become a boutique. The counter still sits at the same angle. A bar that used to host late meetings now sells craft beer to students. The back room holds a different kind of secret. The seafood spot in Little Italy moved addresses, and then resurfaced as a brand, its connection to that morning becoming a tourist line. People pose for photos on the corner not because they love crime, but because the city packages its past as a map of stories. His sits near the top because it contains contradiction, and contradiction sells. The men who followed him adapted to new sponsors and new expectations. The youngest brother earned a reputation for steadiness, a trait that often outlasts flash. A sharp lieutenant known for his quick fists matured into a diplomatic presence in later years, respected for surviving shifts that swallow most soldiers. Their income remained familiar: gambling, loans, vending, service routes attached to nightlife, but handled under a different name on organizational charts that the public never sees. Without the feud, they proved what many suspected: that the business thrives when talk replaces blows, and that quiet rules always earn noise. It is easy to forget in all this talk of myth that people lived under the system he helped build. Shopkeepers adjusted budgets around envelopes that left the counter each week. Drivers scanned mirrors. Rival crews woke wondering if the day would end simple or complicated. Families juggled hope and dread. At the same time, neighbors remember him paying rent for a widow, sending a roast to a house where the father had been laid off, carrying groceries for an elder he called by her first name. The tension between those memories is the point, not a mistake. He engineered fear and comfort at the same time. That's how authority works in places the law visits, but does not live. Friends like to say he had the soul of a performer. He timed entrances, posed for cameras without stiffening, peppered his talk with lines he knew would land. He also made strategic decisions, seizing powerful men to force talks, reading the city's appetite for entertainment, seeking allies beyond the old neighborhood that marked him as an outlier in a world that rewards caution. Those moves brought him attention and enemies in equal measure. He believed he could manage both. For a while, he did. In the end, the ledger caught up, as it almost always does. When his name comes up today, arguments follow. Was he a reformer in a rough world, pushing toward a more open structure, or just a man with an appetite for control? Was the public charm sincere, or a tactic? Could he have changed for good if he had lived? People who loved him say yes. People who feared him say no. People who study him say that he carried both futures in his pocket until the night he didn't. What nobody disputes is that he left a mark that outlasts most men who did what he did. The crimes are clear. The character is complicated. The combination is why the story still travels from stoops to bookshelves, from dinner tables to lyric sheets, as present in the city's imagination as the hiss of a diner griddle at 3 a.m. Rumor and record rarely agree completely, so the picture that survives of him comes from both. Police files say one thing: dates, charges, addresses, sums. Neighbors offer vignettes: the joke outside a bakery, the envelope slid across a kitchen table, the sudden quiet when he entered a room. Journalists wrote profiles that turned his contradictions into copy. Artists used him as a prism for the whole city. Even the nickname that followed him started in a blur and hardened into print. Reporters latched onto a label after a court-ordered psychiatric exam in the late 50 seconds described a volatile temperament. He treated the tag like costume and shield, letting it distract from the calculating side that balanced ledgers and read people before they spoke. The man beneath the label never forgot the math of his world. Money moves, and the person who controls those movements writes the rules. The simplest way to track his life is to follow the income streams. Numbers kept the lights on. In that underground lottery, nickels added to dimes and dimes to dollars, until the daily bank held enough to make everyone serious. He learned early to protect the runners, keep the sheets tight, and silence disputes before they spread. Jukeboxes and vending machines supplemented the take. People underestimate how much cash sits in coins. He did not. He made sure which brand of machine glowed in which bar, and he made sure the split stayed loyal. Loans filled gaps for men and women who couldn't walk into a bank. Those envelopes came with friendly faces and punishing terms. His crew collected on time with a rhythm that made frightened people grateful for predictability. Hijacked loads, liquor, cigarettes, clothing fed the rest. The trick was to choose targets that wouldn't bring floods of uniforms, to move the goods quickly, and to leave enough mystery that a report could say "lost in transit" without provoking a crusade. Alongside the profit ran pressure, administered in degrees. He preferred results without spectacle. A visit, a talk, a timeline, a hint at consequences. If that failed, lessons followed: windows that needed replacing, bruises that healed, cars that stopped starting. Severe episodes appeared during the internal war: the seizure of senior figures to force renegotiation, the failed strangling at a bar that a wandering patrolman stumbled into, the disappearances that became part of Brooklyn folklore. One early turning point, a 1,959 strike, that removed the neighborhood numbers chief, whose nickname advertised his line of work, illustrates how his world operated. A job done efficiently ought to bring a prize. When the prize was parceled to others, resentment set hard. That grudge became a storyline all by itself. The most famous allegation laid at his feet sits in that gray band between rumor and case law. The Midtown killing of a rival head, whose death in a shop remains one of the century's most discussed underworld acts. Versions of the story put his unit near the action as muscle, as facilitators, as men in the wider circle. Other versions say the hit belonged to a completely different set. The court never decided. He never did either, except to smile at the gasps when the topic came up. What mattered to his peers was that the rumor elevated him. Men who had ignored a Brooklyn tough now looked at him like a strategist with reach. That kind of attention comes with invitations and with enemies who wait. The years inside reshaped how he moved without erasing what he did. He read widely history that traced how power changes hands, novels that follow men who make bad bargains, essays about freedom, responsibility, and fate. He drew enough to hang small canvases at friends' homes, a habit that complicated the rough outline people wanted to stick to him. He debated with teachers who visited the facility and befriended inmates whose backgrounds would have set them apart on the street. He came out speaking both languages, the one of streets and the one of salons, and he tried to fuse them in a city that rewards that trick until it doesn't. The choice to push beyond the old social boundaries was partly practical and partly personal. He knew that growing beyond a single neighborhood could insulate him from old feuds and open new avenues. He also liked comedians with quick tongues, actors with good timing, columnists who could turn a quip into a paragraph. A novelist parodied his world in a book about bumbling gangsters, then saw it turned into a movie while he was away. A later film built around his legend used a different name, but told a story audiences recognized. Years after that, a songwriter wrote a long ballad that cast him as a tragic rebel, a choice that angered some who had paid his prices and thrilled others drawn to the romance of doomed defiance. Debates over those portrayals outlasted many court cases. The night at the seafood spot shifted him from participant to symbol. New York has a way of turning corners into landmarks, and Mulberry Street gained another without trying. The actor who hugged him earlier became a piece of the story because he had been there. The friend from Greece who returned fire earned a permanent nickname in the papers because his composure under pressure kept the room from being a slaughter. The names that floated behind the scenes belonged to a shorter list. The young soldier who ran to federal offices and described a plan. The triggerman he named, now dead. The higher-ups whose titles made them unreachable by ordinary means. And later, a union enforcer from another city who claimed in a memoir that he alone had crossed the street and made the shot. Reporters and former investigators never agreed on which version deserved the headline. What they agreed on was motive. He had spent a decade pushing against a structure that punishes pushers. When an opening appeared, someone took it. The immediate years after his death were less dramatic than the films suggest. Money engines welcome quiet. An arrangement brokered at the top shifted the remaining crew under a different banner. The youngest brother ran day-to-day work with the discipline he'd always shown. A lieutenant who once led with impulse learned diplomacy. Collections normalized. Divisions cooled. The rival family cycled through leaders and internal storms of its own, including new trials and a later wave of in-house warfare that had nothing to do with President Street. Law enforcement adapted to the era, using laws designed to treat criminal networks as networks rather than as collections of isolated acts. When big trials landed, they targeted councils, not just soldiers. By then, the man whose story started this chapter had already become a reference point, a cautionary tale, and a pop character. Personal details from his last years kept filtering out through interviews and memoirs. His widow described a husband who read late, who cried at a certain song, who worried about the child he had taken into his life, who considered a serious move toward film or theater as a way to redirect his need to be seen. She also acknowledged that he still balanced books that depended on people paying from fear. She didn't pretend he was harmless. She insisted he was more than the sheets suggested. People who had collected under him nodded at parts and winced at others. That's the trouble with legends. They flatten. She tried to thicken the portrait. Longtime neighbors told small stories that explained more than headlines. Once, during a snowstorm, he sent men to shovel out driveways on a block where elders lived alone and made them accept coffee rather than cash. Another time, he sat beside a shopkeeper who thought she would lose the lease and mapped out a plan to survive 3 months of slow business. These aren't alibis, they're context. He understood that goodwill is currency. He also understood that fear is, too. He preferred both in circulation, which is why the neighborhoods closest to him remain split when his name comes up. One voice praises the protector. Another remembers the price. His rise rested on useful skills, reading people, timing entrances, improvising, solutions, and on hard choices, pressuring those who resisted, escalating when words failed, exploiting routinized fear. The kidnapping of high-ranking figures in 1961 revealed both sides at once, daring that impressed younger men, a breach of taboo that older men would never forgive. From that point, steps became harder to reverse. Even sincerity couldn't save him. If he truly wanted to turn toward art and nightclubs and dinners with critics, he still had to pass through a gauntlet of men who thought he had to be taught humility. The lesson arrived on a morning when his guard was down because he was with his family and friends. The city made meaning out of him because he reflected so many of its favorite illusions. Reinvention? He tried. Hustle? He had it. Culture? He learned it late but spoke it fluently. Community? He nurtured it and exploited it. Rule breaking? He treated rules as suggestions until someone with more power treated him the same way. Put differently, he fit the city's archetype. A self-inventor who outran his past until the sprint turned into a circle. There's a ledger of outcomes that keeps the story honest. Shopkeepers who paid protection lost money they could have spent on stock or staff. Borrowers trapped in weekly percentage spirals lost sleep and sometimes businesses. Floormen who balked at vending splits found trouble on their doorstep. Drivers whose loads disappeared earned reputations for carelessness in companies that couldn't always absorb the loss. On the other side of that ledger were the benefits people in his orbit still talk about: a feeling of order on blocks where random predators backed off, a safety net that caught a family between jobs, an enforcer who played chess with a teenager and told him, "Not this life." Those outcomes sit together. Remove one and you're telling a fable, not history. Tastes change, even in the underworld. After his death, a quieter model won out, at least for a while. Bosses preferred fewer headlines, fewer stunts, fewer public gestures that could be interpreted as taunts. The community activism that once gave one leader a platform drew too much heat and faded. The grandstanding that had helped our subject gather a new circle also looked, in retrospect, like a red flag. Men who lasted did so by letting income blur with ordinary business, by building fronts that paid taxes and soothed inspectors. The rough edges never disappeared. They hid behind clean signage and patient growth. Artists didn't lose interest. The index of works that circle him grew. Profiles that treat him as a poet of sidewalks. Memoirs that recast him as a friend with a complicated ledger. Television episodes that borrow his best lines and place them in fictional mouths. Songs that turn his fate into a cautionary chorus. One later film, based on a Teamster's account, insisted that an itinerant enforcer from another city took the shot. Opinions split along predictable lines: believers in the memoir's author and skeptics who had pored over the early reports and preferred the original local list. He would have enjoyed the argument for the same reason he enjoyed a crowded room. Everything becomes theater if you frame it right. If there's a point to dwelling on his crimes rather than just his charisma, it's this. The charm was not a mask for the work. It was a tool of the work. He persuaded first. He escalated second. The escalation sometimes led to injuries and disappearances. We can list only as probabilities because the code kept witnesses quiet. The confirmed acts: extortion of a shopkeeper that led to a long sentence, loan operations with rates that would bury a borrower, control of gambling that let no competitor breathe, hijacks that stripped cargo without spilling blood make a clear picture anyway. Add the seizures of power inside his own family's ranks, the suspected involvement in removals that changed territory, and the retaliations that followed, and you have a career defined by force, refined into habit. He mattered because he tried to be two men at once, and almost managed it: street chief in the afternoon, city wit at night. That balancing act looked plausible because he was smart, funny, and attentive, and because New York rewards the performance. It failed for the quiet reason such auditions often fail. Too many people with long memories disliked what he represented. They waited. And on a spring night when he was thinking about celebration rather than defense, they acted. Quickly and without grandstanding. In keeping with their own idea of how business should be handled. Years later, when you stand on a block he loved, you can hear both verdicts if you listen. A deli owner says he once paid and once was saved, and he isn't sure which mattered more. A retired cop says he was a sharper talker than most of the men he cuffed, and that the city is poorer without characters like that, even while he lists the ways those characters kept small people small. A musician plays the long ballad for tips, and a passerby shakes a head and says the song lies. All of them are right in parts. That's the shape of a life built in a city that compresses contradictions until they sparkle. He did not live to test whether the gentler life he sketched in his last year could have held. The crew he built survived by becoming less like him. The people who loved him held on to the private man he revealed at their tables. The public kept the version that sells tickets and paperbacks. Between those poles sits the record. A boy formed by hard streets. A man who enforced order for profit. An operator who pushed his luck. A reader who wanted more. A husband who tried to make a home. And a target whose enemies finished an argument that had begun a decade earlier. The city turned the page. The story stayed open. Time smooths sharp edges, but certain stories keep their ridges. His is one of them. Blocks he walked have new awnings. Stoops host different voices. Neon glows in colors he never saw. Yet his name still carries a hush in the right cafes and a shrug in others. The people who cared for him settled into lives that did not fit headlines. His widow carved out work on her own terms and guarded memories she wanted to keep whole. The stepchild he doted on grew past the shadow and made a path where a last name didn't decide everything. The youngest brother kept at the routines that had sustained their household for years, then moved the crew to a steadier berth when top figures brokered a truce. Survival is often less about victory than about choosing quiet when quiet pays. From that calmer distance, the outline of his life stands clear. He learned early that a city's hidden economy rests on habits repeated so often they feel like rules. Numbers bets made at candy counters and taverns formed a daily river. He protected runners, kept banks balanced, and made sure disputes ended before they spread. Vending and jukebox routes turned coins into cash that could pay a crew and show a neighborhood who had authority. Loans with steep, weekly percentages filled gaps for desperate borrowers. Those who paid on time earned smiles. Those who didn't drew pressure. Hijacked loads garments, liquor, cigarettes left docks, and never reached warehouses. He expected a cut from every corner his people touched, and he enforced those expectations with conversation first and, if necessary, a lesson that stopped short of lasting injury, but left memory. When he felt slighted by the men above him, he didn't sulk. He reached. The removal of the neighborhood's numbers chief in 1959, done with a speed that startled, should have brought a vast reward. It didn't. Leadership spread the prize around to preserve balance. The insult hardened into a principle. If respect isn't given, apply pressure until it appears. In 1961, that idea turned into action when he and his brothers seized high-ranking figures, close advisors, and trusted captains to force new terms. The taboo they broke still draws attention. They didn't threaten outsiders. They reached into the heart of their own circle. Promises followed, then evaporated. Soon after, men tried to strangle his older brother in a bar. A uniformed officer's well-timed appearance averted a funeral. Any hope of easy reconciliation ended that day. From then on, survival and standing were the only topics. The city's files give the official backbone. Arrests in his youth for petty theft, possession of burglary tools, and disorderly conduct. Later, repeated brushes tied to illegal betting and control of vending routes. A record of illegal possession of weapons. A pattern of intimidation designed to make reluctant business owners comply. The one that stuck hardest came from a shopkeeper willing to talk. An extortion case that outlined threats wrapped in polite phrases, men lingering outside until a payment appeared, a schedule that owed nothing to a bank, but everything to fear. Conviction followed. He served most of his 30s locked away. Those years produced a different kind of paper trail. Library logs, notes in margins, small canvases mailed to friends, accounts of long arguments about justice, art, and fate. He returned speaking about books and films with the same ease he'd once reserved for ledgers. Rumors filled the spaces where courts never reached. A midtown killing of a feared rival's boss in a shop became underworld folklore. Some versions placed his unit near the planning. Others shut them out entirely. No case settled it. Another story, more local, told of a rival loyalist who left for a night meeting during the family war and didn't return. Those who crossed the brothers in those years sometimes vanished. The code kept names from rooms with court stenographers. Even the last act of his story, The Little Italy Dawn, remains fed by competing narratives. A neighborhood insider ran to federal agents and described spotting the target, phoning seniors, watching a team head for the seafood place. He named a triggerman who died soon after. Years later, a union enforcer from another city claimed the role for himself in a memoir, describing a walk across Mulberry and a cool escape. People chose sides based on which storyteller they trusted. None of it brought a clear verdict to a jury box. Pop culture sealed the legend. A columnist's comic novel, thinly veiled, turned the internal feud into farce, and then into a film that made audiences laugh at the chaos. A gritty movie later carried his nickname to marquees and framed him as an urban anti-hero struggling against fate. A songwriter gave him a sprawling ballad and painted him as a rebel done in by a rigid order. The song provoked arguments that never quite ended: romance against realism, empathy against accounting. Decades later, another film used a teamster's recollections to insist that an outsider took the birthday shot. The city never stopped arguing because argument is part of how the city remembers. What neighbors retained were smaller, sturdier things. He made eye contact with doormen, tipped waiters like every shift mattered, and remembered the names of children who watched from stoops. He fussed over his wife's coat, straightened a stepdaughter's homework papers, and bragged about her progress to friends with the pride of a man who understood what steadiness can do for a kid. He stayed tender with elders who had known his mother, carrying bags, shoveling snow, sending food at holidays. Those gestures weren't charity so much as an awareness that goodwill, like fear, earns dividends. He built both, often on the same block. The larger picture doesn't soften. He ran rackets that taxed small businesses and trapped borrowers. He enforced order through the threat of harm. He arranged or sanctioned attacks when persuasion failed. He pushed into a closed hierarchy with kidnappings that humiliated leaders who prided themselves on control. He returned from prison with a vow to blend art and legitimacy into his life, then stepped back into the same underworld schedules because that was the skill set he owned and the network he understood. He said he wanted something different. He kept doing what worked. The tension between desire and habit never found a stable peace. Law enforcement shifted strategies partly because men like him taught them to. Prosecutors leaned on conspiracy statutes that treat an enterprise as a whole, not just as isolated acts. Wiretaps captured the cadence of a life that likes to speak in hints. Cooperative witnesses, rare in earlier decades, became more common when faced with long sentences under new laws. Big cases later rolled up counsels rather than just soldiers, a pattern that would change the city's underworld in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. By then, he was long gone, but the playbook had been rewritten on the lessons of his era. His brother's fates illustrate the way this world bends toward continuity when it can. The eldest, who had survived the strangling attempt, died of illness before the 1,970 seconds dawned fully. A quiet exit for a man whom the streets once expected to die by force. The youngest steered the remnant through the transfer to another banner. Worked the old engine's gambling, loans, vending, service contracts, and aged past the years their friends had predicted, proof that steady beats flashy more often than not. Some lieutenants matured into diplomats after young years defined by fists. The business changed costumes, set up fronts, learned to talk to inspectors, and kept moving. It's worth noting how much of his appeal came from performance. He timed entrances, told stories with punchlines that landed, and understood that in New York, presence itself can be currency. He dressed as if each night needed a little theater. He loved clever people and wanted them at his table. He wasn't faking curiosity. He had worked hard to teach himself what the schools he skipped once offered, and he took pride in repeating a line from a book as readily as an old joke from President Street. That mixture made him hard to categorize and therefore irresistible to writers. For all the spotlight, the cost to ordinary people needs plain accounting. Shopkeepers under his protection paid money that might have hired help or purchased stock. Borrowers living under weekly percentages lost sleep, and sometimes businesses. Drivers marked as unlucky after cargo vanished found fewer shifts. Rivals collected bruises that were never reported but always remembered. Families lived with the dread that a knock on the door would carry news they couldn't absorb. Against that, people also recall a strange sense of order. Predators who preyed at random stayed away. Block parties happened without trouble. Holiday baskets arrived at apartments where paychecks had stopped. Both realities belonged to his world. A fair telling holds them together. He believed attention could be armor, that if enough people loved the character he played, the men who resented the moves he made would hesitate. That proved untrue. The last night showed how fast the curtain can drop. He finished a show, hugged an actor whose face everyone knew, wandered to a late meal, and stepped into a rule he had always accepted. In their world, someone who feels encroached upon eventually acts. His friend from Greece showed nerve and steadiness, returning fire to keep the table from turning into something worse, then spent hours answering questions about seconds that repeat in the mind forever. The men who planned the attack faded back into rumor and died out or adapted, like their peers always do. If you stand on a spring sidewalk when the city has that overnight hush it knows how to conjure, you can imagine him as he often was in quieter hours, jacket over the shoulder, half smile in place, reading a room from the doorway before deciding where to sit. He liked to think he could pick the table that would shape the night's fortune. For a while, he did. The longer view reminds us that fortune has many authors. He wrote part of his story with daring and part with pressure. Others wrote the rest. He doesn't resolve into a moral as neatly as a fable would prefer, but a few lessons show through. Charisma is a tool, not a shield. Power built on fear can organize a block, yet it sends a bill that comes due in ways you can't schedule. Reinvention is possible, but not if the only roads you trust lead back to the same doors. A city will turn anyone interesting into a story, and stories can keep you alive in memory long after the ledger has closed. He wanted to be larger than the life that trained him. In some ways, he managed that. In the way that matters most to those who loved him, time ran out before he could prove it. The burros keep walking. Cafes close and open. Old men in caps tell young ones how things used to be. A song comes on in a bar and someone says, "That's about him, you know." And someone else says, "That's nonsense." A novel is pulled from a shelf and passed to a friend who asks what's true and what's not. The answer, as always with him, is both. The record is there in files. The man is there in stories. Put them together, and you get a life that feels like New York, impossible to reduce, full of hustle and warmth, clever and unkind at once. The city turned the page, but if you listen in the quiet after last call, you can still hear him, just a little, laughing at a joke he probably told 100 times, convinced he could bend the next hour to his will. Then the hour turns, as hours do, and the streets go on. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Joe Gallo here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet journey through rebellion, charisma, and the rhythm of a life lived boldly. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.